Well, we outlined in a plan that I published with a group of people a couple of weeks ago what we thought the right criteria would be for reopening the country. And we talked about a sustained reduction in new cases and then waiting a full replication cycle, so 14 days, which is the incubation period, the maximum incubation period for the virus itself. Wait 14 days after you see a sustained reduction in new cases. If you were working off that criteria, and I think it's a reasonable criteria, that would put you at some point in May, because you're going to see a sustained reduction in new cases really over the next 2 weeks nationally, and probably in New York as well as parts of the southeast where there's been later spread. And so if you wait another week or two after that, that puts you in mid-May. So I think in May, regardless, we're going to be contemplating reopening parts of the economy. I think it's going to be gradual. I think we're going to do it in a staggered fashion to make sure that we can do it safely and that we don't have an explosion or reignition in cases. But I think regardless, there's going to be a lot of pressure from the business community on governors and on the national government to reopen the economy. And I think in May we're going to get that underway.
Who should make the decision on that, Dr. Gottlieb? The president says it is his authority. Meantime, you have governors along the northeastern corridor, also on the West Coast, saying they're the ones who are going to make the decision. What makes the most sense to you?
Well, I think that what's likely to happen is that the federal government and the White House is going to put out some general recommendations for the governors, but ultimately these decisions and how they get implemented are going to be made by local officials and by the governors. That's the way that this has been being managed up until this point. And I think that that's likely to continue. And I think what the governors are going to do is they're going to take a phased approach. They're going to say, well, certain businesses can reopen, but you can only reopen with maybe 75% of your employees at any one time. So maybe you have to run more shifts. Maybe people who are older or more vulnerable should stay home for an extra week while we restart this and get people back into the workplace. You shouldn't have gatherings of, let's say, more than 10 people, or you shouldn't have conferences. So they'll put out guidelines on some recommendations. So you do this in a staggered fashion over the course of the month, and then they'll have some objective measurements along the way to make sure that we're not seeing a reignition in cases. They'll be monitoring very closely to see if the case counts continue to go down or if they start ticking up again. Probably the most important thing, though, that we can do right now is continue to be vigilant about good hand hygiene, avoiding contacts that are unnecessary. Even as we go back to work in May, I think if people continue to engage in good practices when it comes to just the ordinary routines of daily life and cleaning shared surfaces, things like that, that could mitigate a lot of the risks. So I'm hopeful that the American people, having come out of this experience and seen how devastating this virus is, are going to continue to be vigilant about their everyday activities. And that in and of itself can have a big impact on the transmissibility of this infection.
How do you reopen a city, Dr. Gottlieb, like a New York City or Los Angeles, for example, when compared to what you may consider a second-tier city in terms of size and population?
Well, it's clearly going to be more difficult in the larger cities and also more risky. And I think you're likely to see cities like New York, even if the decline is more rapid in New York and you see transmission break off more in a more robust way in New York City, they might make a decision to restart the city, the economic life of the city, or most aspects of it later than some other parts of the country that maybe aren't on the same part of their curve. They might actually be on be a little bit a week or two behind New York, but have less risk overall because they're less of a dense city, or they had less cases overall. So I think this is going to be highly variable across the country. And the very big, dense cities that had a lot of spread, like New York, like Los Angeles, like Detroit, like Chicago, may be a little bit more cautious in terms of stepping into this than parts of the countries that had later spread. So they may be at a sort of earlier stage in their epidemic, but they're less dense, there's less risk there overall.
Let's talk about what this might feel like, what it might look like on the other side of this. I have a Time magazine article here. They did an interview with you in which you say, quote, "This can become a livable pathogen where it's there, it circulates. You're going to hear on the evening news about outbreaks in a dorm or a movie theater, but people go about their normal lives. Things change, but the changes we make are livable." How should we accept how things are going to be once we try and get back to normal? This virus is going to be with us for an awfully long time. Is that what you're saying?
I think until we get to a vaccine, this is going to be something that circulates. And even after we have a vaccine, this is going to continue to be something that probably circulates at a low level. And so we're going to have to learn how to mitigate the risk of this virus. Between now and the fall, it's going to be touch and go. We're going to be at greater risk because we're not going to have all the tools that we want in terms of very broad testing and therapeutics that can effectively treat this. I'm hoping by the fall, we're going to have those things on hand. And the fall is when the risk is really going to increase. We're going to get out of this epidemic. We're going to be heading into a period where cases are going to be declining. Hopefully the summer is somewhat of a backstop against this virus heading into July and August. But then there's a risk that it really reignites in the fall when we're coming back to work, when kids are back in school, when college campuses are back in session. And there probably is going to be some seasonality to this virus as well. So it's going to want to come back in the fall and the winter. That's typically what we see with coronaviruses. So we're going to have to learn how to mitigate that risk on an ongoing basis until we can get to a vaccine. And the key is going to be very widespread testing and trying to find people with the infection and isolate them before they have a chance to spread it to other people. And many people get this infection, as you know, this virus, and they're asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic, so they can inadvertently spread it and not know it.
Let's talk about therapeutics and a vaccine for a minute. It appears as though there was some good data today on the Gilead drug, remdesivir. How are you thinking about that, where we are in the race to have therapeutics? And I also read there were 70 vaccines now globally in development with 3 candidates already in human trials. Put all of that into perspective for us tonight.
Well, I think the key right now, there's a lot of drugs in development, there's a lot of vaccines in development, to your point. I think the key right now is to try to focus on what the nearer term opportunities are that could be most impactful. And when you sort of narrow it down, you look at the vaccines that have the highest probability of success and can be scaled, their manufacturing can be scaled, and you look at the drugs that could have an impact on this disease. They look like they're active, or they could be active, and they could be available in time for the fall. That's a much more limited subset, and I would be focusing attention on those things, even from a regulatory standpoint at FDA, focusing resources, focusing development time on those opportunities, because we really need some therapeutics by the fall. And so the ones that become very interesting are remdesivir looks active. I suspect it's not going to be a home run, it's not a cure, but if used early in the course of the disease, it probably can have an impact on the disease and mitigate the risk from the disease for a good number of patients based on just very preliminary evidence. This is conjecture at this point. The other products that look like they could potentially be active against this, based on how we understand they work, are the antibodies. These are drugs that are basically engineered antibodies to target the virus. We made these successfully against Ebola. We had a drug that was successful against MERS in the clinic and in animal studies. And there's no reason we can't engineer through biotech processes antibodies that can target this virus. There's 4 companies working on this right now: Regeneron, Lilly, Vir Biotechnology, and Amgen. And I believe one or more of these could be successful. These are the kinds of things we could potentially have for the fall. So we really got to focus on how we pull these through so that we have a different cabinet chest, we have a different therapeutic armamentarium in time for the fall, when there is a risk that this virus is going to come back, and we're going to face the risk of outbreaks and potentially another epidemic.